Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 32 of my historical travel podcast, Voyage to go, history, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In this true story, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist in the 18th century, aboard the sailing ship under the command of James Cook. Georg's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it more understandable, I have largely translated it into modern language. His knowledge is that of the late 18th century, so I will place some of his statements in context and provide additional information. What happened in the last episode?
In the last episode of the journey, the crew explored Ewa Island in Tonga, where lush gardens, peaceful burial sites, and detailed local customs created the impression of an enchanted island. Georg and his companions observed tattooing, clothing, and ornaments among the people, and noticed the unusual custom of cutting off little fingers as a sign of mourning. They also encountered another practice, round burn marks on the cheeks, possibly linked to healing rituals like moxibustion. Despite friendly exchanges, the islanders grew reluctant to trade food, prompting the crew to shift toward requesting provisions directly. Among the goods traded were handcrafted combs, jewelry, mats, and wooden weapons. Georg explored the inland areas, finding beautifully maintained plantations, coral stone tombs, and vampire bats clinging to casuarina trees. Later, the expedition moved on to Tongatapu, where they were welcomed by locals offering fruit, poultry, and ornaments. Georg and others noted the refined agriculture and the friendliness of the people. They explored the island's flat terrain, entered shaded forests, and visited a coral-built tomb where finger amputation marked a family member's death. The episode concluded as they crossed the island on foot and finally reached the eastern shore and the wide inlet known as Maria Bay.
Monday, October 4th, 1773, Tongatapu.
In this area, the land gradually sloped down to a sandy beach, while at the northern tip, the coast was formed by a vertical coral cliff, undercut and overhanging in some places. This type of rock formation only occurs underwater, so it could be assumed that where it was found above sea level, significant changes to the Earth's surface must have occurred. Whether this was caused by a gradual drop in sea level or by some violent upheaval, Georg could not say. However, if one assumed it was the former, then the island must be relatively young in origin, and in that case, it was hard to understand how it could already be covered with soil, plants, and forests, so densely populated and so well cultivated, as they indeed found it to be. At the foot of the steep cliff that had inspired these thoughts, many sea snails clung to the rock, tempting them to wade knee-deep onto a reef as the tide was already rising. Soon the swelling sea forced them to seek dry land again, but the cliff was so steep everywhere that they struggled to find a place where they could climb up. On their way back through the plantations, they encountered various islanders returning from the trading area. In passing, they purchased many fishing hooks, ornaments, and a fishing net designed similarly to their own drag nets, tied from thin but strong thread-like cords. The same people also sold them various woven mats and pieces of cloth. The most remarkable item they traded for was a knee-length skirt decorated with star-shaped figures made from coconut fiber. These stars, each about 7 to 10 centimeters, 2.8 to 3.9 inches, in diameter, touched at their tips and were adorned with small red feathers and shell coral. Along the way, they saw new evidence of the care the islanders put into agriculture. At several places, they found weeds neatly pulled out and piled up to dry. After walking for some time, they realized they had lost their way. They hired a local guide, who led them, along one of the often described field paths between two fences, straight back to the Whaituka, the burial ground they had passed earlier. There they found Captain Cook, Captain Furneaux, and Mr. Hodges, sitting in the grass with a large group of islanders. They were engaged in conversation with an old man who was clearly highly respected among his people, as he was surrounded by a large crowd wherever he went. This man had led their companions to two Whaitukas and delivered a solemn speech or prayer, repeatedly turning to Captain Cook and seemingly asking him something. Each time he paused as if expecting a response. When Captain Cook nodded, the old man continued his speech. At times, however, he seemed to lose his train of thought, and someone nearby would assist him. From this ceremony and the setting, they concluded that the man must be a priest. But this did not necessarily imply they practiced any form of idolatry, for as far as they could tell from their knowledge of these people's religious customs, there was no trace of animal worship like among the Tahitians. The people here seemed to believe in and worship only an invisible supreme being. Why these people, like the inhabitants of Tahiti and the Society Islands, performed their religious rites beside graves remained a mystery. A people's religious practices are usually the hardest and last thing a traveler comes to understand, especially when, like them, he is inexperienced in the local language. Moreover, the language of religion often differs significantly from everyday speech, and religion itself is often shrouded in mystery, particularly in societies with priests who may benefit from exploiting the people's credulity. From there they hurried back to the coast, where trading of fruit, livestock, and pigs was in full swing. As a curiosity, they purchased a large, flat breastplate made from a round bone, likely from a whale. It measured about 45 centimeters, 18 inches, in diameter, was as white as ivory, and finely polished. Afterward, the islanders brought them a new musical instrument, consisting of 9 or 10 reed pipes, each about 23 centimeters, 9 inches long, bound together with coconut fibers. The lengths of the pipes varied only slightly, and long and short pipes were mixed without any particular order. At the top, each had an opening into which the player blew with their lips, moving the instrument side to side in front of the mouth to produce different tones in any desired sequence. It typically produced 4 to 5 notes, and never spanned more than a full octave. The resemblance of this instrument to the syrinx or pan flute of the ancient Greeks gave it more value in their eyes than any musical sophistication. For even in the way it was played, music lovers could tell that this divine art was still in its infancy here. The vocal music resembled that of ewa, and the voices sounded harmonious enough. The women also kept time with their fingers while singing, and did so with great precision. However, as the singing was limited to 4 tones, it lacked much modulation. Among their instruments was also a flute made of bamboo, about as thick as their regular flutes, and here, as in Tahiti, played through the nostrils. Most of these were decorated with small burned-in figures and had 4 to 5 tone holes, whereas Tahitian flutes usually had only 3. They also found these burned-in decorations on their wooden food bowls and other household utensils. Although it was already late in the day when they returned on board with their newly acquired and discovered curiosities, the ship was still surrounded by a crowd of islanders, either arriving in canoes or swimming around, making a great deal of noise. Among the swimmers were many women who played in the water like amphibians and were easily persuaded to come aboard naked. They cared as little for chastity as the common girls of Tahiti and the Society Islands, and it's easy to imagine that the sailors took advantage of these willing beauties. They offered scenes that might have suited a temple of Venus. A shirt, a piece of cloth, or a few nails were often enough to make these women offer themselves without shame. However, this promiscuity was by no means universal, and Georg was convinced that not a single married woman committed adultery. Had they known more about the island's social classes, it likely would have turned out, as in Tahiti, that the promiscuous women came only from the lower ranks of society. Still, it remained a peculiar trait of the Southern Islanders that unmarried people were allowed to give themselves freely to many lovers. Should one really expect that girls who followed their natural urges would become better wives than those who were more innocent and reserved. But it is pointless to try to find rational reasons for the arbitrary customs of humankind, especially concerning the opposite sex, about which people have always disagreed across all times and places. In certain parts of India, no man of status marries a virgin. In Europe, however, a dishonored virgin has little hope of ever regaining her reputation. Turks, Arabs, and Tatars take their jealousy so far as to obsess over imagined signs of virginity, while to the Malabari it means so little that he offers it to his god. None of the women stayed on board after sunset. They all returned to land to sleep under the trees near the shore, just like most of their fellow islanders. There they lit many fires, and one could hear them talking through much of the night. They seemed so eager to trade with the Europeans that they didn't return to their distant homes. European goods were in high demand among them. A chicken typically cost a large nail. For smaller nails they offered fruit like bananas and coconuts. The islanders wore these iron nails as ornaments, often on a string around their necks or inserted through the ear. The chickens were unusually large and had excellent flavor. Their feathers were usually glossy and showed shades of red and gold. The roosters were especially sought after by the sailors, who indulged in the barbaric pleasure of making them fight. Ever since leaving Huahine, the sailors had tormented the poor animals daily, clipping their wings and goading them to attack one another. They had trained the roosters from Huahine so well that many fought as fiercely as the best English gamecocks. But they had no such luck with the roosters here, and when these refused to fight, the sailors eventually decided to eat them. The next morning, the captain's friend, Attaha, came aboard very early and had breakfast with them. His clothing consisted of woven materials, and because of the morning chill, he had draped a mat over his shoulders. Mr. Hodges wanted to draw him on this occasion, but since the islander lacked the attention and focus necessary for such a task, as was often the case among all uncivilized peoples, it took some effort to get him to sit still for a while. Nevertheless, the drawing turned out very well. Mr. Hodges chose a pose in which Attaha held an iron nail, a gift he had received, above his head as a gesture of thanks. This portrait was later masterfully engraved in copper by Mr. Sherwin, and through the gentle features of this man, one could gain a true impression of the character of the nation as a whole. After breakfast, the captain and Georg accompanied Attaha back to shore. As they came on deck for this purpose, Attaha noticed a Tahitian dog. The sight of this animal filled him with great joy. He struck both hands against his chest, turned to the captain, and cried out in delight more than 20 times, "Guri!" Guri means dog in Tahiti. Guri has the same meaning in New Zealand. They were surprised that he knew the name of an animal that didn't exist in his own land. This knowledge must have either come from ancestral tradition, originating on other islands or the mainland where such animals existed, or perhaps dogs had once lived on his island but had been lost by chance. Finally, there was the possibility that they still had contact with lands where dogs were kept. To complete the honest Attaha's joy, the Europeans gave him a male and a female dog, which he carried ashore in utter delight. Georg stayed on board the entire day to sort the plants and birds they had collected during their first landing. Their number was considerable, given the small size of the island. The locals remained constantly around the ship with many canoes, and others, likely too poor to own one, swam back and forth from the shore. Their vessels were of various types. The ordinary small canoes used to bring goods to market had a sharp keel and were pointed at both ends, but so narrow that waves often splashed over them. To prevent the canoe from filling with water, both ends were covered with boards above the surface. To avoid capsizing, they usually had a light outrigger made of poles. The canoe itself was made of several planks of hard brown wood, joined with coconut fibers and sewn together so skillfully that they seemed very watertight. The Tahitians simply bored holes through the planks and pulled the coconut fibers through, which often made their canoes leaky. On Tongatapu, however, there was a raised ridge or flange on the inside edge of the planks, right at the seam. Only through this ridge, rather than through the full plank thickness, did the cords forming the seam pass. Along the outer edge of the covering boards, or the narrow planks at both ends of the canoe, there were 7 to 8 round knotted protrusions. These appeared to imitate the small finlets along the belly of bonito, albacore, or mackerel. Georg believed the islanders had modeled their boats on these swift fish. Although the canoes were usually 4.5 to 5.5 meters, 15 to 18 feet long, they were polished from end to end as smoothly as fine carpentry. This was all the more admirable considering the islanders' tools consisted only of poor bits of coral, and their planes were made of stingray skin. The paddles were also beautifully polished, made of the same type of wood, and had short, leaf-shaped broad blades similar to those of Tahiti. The second type of canoe was equipped for sailing, and those knowledgeable in maritime matters had to admit that they were excellently suited for this purpose. They saw one of them in Maria Bay. It consisted of 2 smaller canoes fixed close together. The planks were joined in the same way as the previously described ones, but both canoes were fully covered and fitted with a raised frame or platform. Some of these sailing canoes could carry 150 men. The sails, triangular in shape, were made of strong mats, sometimes woven with the figure of a turtle or a rooster, though rather clumsily. However, since detailed descriptions of shipbuilding would bore most people and were only instructive for seafarers, Georg did not go into further detail. From the little he did say about the good construction of these sailing boats, one could already conclude that the inhabitants of these islands had to be much more experienced and capable seamen than those of Tahiti and the Society Islands. Among the crowd swarming around the ships, Georg noticed several individuals whose hair was burned and powdered at the tips. Upon closer inspection, it turned out that the powder was made from shell or coral lime. Due to its caustic properties, it had damaged and scorched the hair. The fashion for hair powder had gone so far here that people had already discovered how to dye it in different colors. One of the men had blue hair, and several individuals, both men and women, used orange powder made from turmeric. St. Jerome had already criticized Roman women for a similar custom in his time. Human follies are so alike that the long-forgotten fashions of ancient Europeans still reappear today among these modern Antipodeans.
The term Antipodeans refers to people living on the opposite side of the earth from Europe, literally at the antipodes. In this context, it is a poetic and somewhat playful way of referring to the inhabitants of the South Pacific, especially those encountered during Cook's voyages, such as the Polynesians. In 18th century European literature, calling someone an Antipodean often implied both geographical and cultural distance. It emphasized the idea that these people lived in a world completely opposite to Europe, not only in location but also in customs, beliefs, and ways of life. However, Georg Forster uses the term with irony. Although the islanders seem distant and exotic, their behavior mirrors that of ancient Europeans. By comparing the fashion of powdered and colored hair among Polynesians to that of Roman women, and citing St. Jerome's disapproval, Forster highlights a recurring theme of Enlightenment thought, that human nature, including vanity and fashion, is universal. The use of modern Antipodeans humorously suggests that despite the vast distances and cultural differences, people on opposite sides of the world often share similar whims and habits.
Georg's father did not return until evening because he had taken a long walk to the southernmost end of the island. Around midday he was caught in heavy rain and forced to seek shelter in a plantation hut. Fortunately for him, the owner of the hut was at home. He welcomed Georg's father kindly and invited him to sit on the clean mats that covered the floor. Meanwhile, the host left briefly to arrange refreshments and soon returned with a few coconuts. Then he opened his underground oven and brought out some bananas and fish wrapped in leaves. They were perfectly cooked and tasted excellent. The cooking style here was identical to that on Tahiti, and the islanders were just as hospitable. The reason they had experienced fewer examples of this hospitality was simply because they rarely found anyone at home. Most people stayed at the trading site by the sea. Georg's father thanked his host for the warm welcome with some nails and glass beads, which the man gratefully accepted, holding them over his head with the usual fagafatai. He also accompanied the guest to the beach and willingly carried a number of spears and clubs that Georg's father had traded for along the way. As harmless as these good people behaved toward them, they were nevertheless not spared from the misfortunes that often accompanied the discovery of foreign lands. Their goods were certainly no less valuable or enticing to the islanders than they were to the Tahitians, so it was no wonder they were equally tempted to steal them. The captains had barely been ashore the following day when one islander seized the opportunity to steal a jacket from their boat. To secure his loot, he immediately dove underwater and upon reaching the shore disappeared into the thick crowd of his fellow islanders. Still, the sailors didn't hesitate to fire at him. Without the captain's order, they shot 7 times. As a result, several innocent people were wounded. Nevertheless, the islanders remained so good-natured that they neither abandoned the shore nor the trading place, nor did they show any distrust due to this rash behavior. They let the bullets whistle past their ears without flinching. A few hours later, another man on board the ship did the same. He sneaked into the navigator's cabin and stole several mathematical books, a sword, a ruler, and other small items, things he could make no use of in his life. The theft was discovered just as he was about to escape in a canoe. A boat was sent after him to recover the stolen goods. As soon as he realized what was happening, he threw everything overboard. The items were retrieved by a second boat while the first continued the chase. To catch up with him, the sailors fired a musket ball through the stern of his canoe, whereupon he and several others jumped into the water. Though they pursued him further, his remarkable speed kept him safe for quite a while. He dove beneath the boat of his pursuers and even once lifted out their rudder without being caught. Eventually, one of the sailors threw the boathook at him. Unfortunately, the iron struck the islander beneath the ribs and pierced his body. This allowed the sailor to pull the man easily toward the boat and lift him aboard. But the islander waited for the right moment, and before anyone could react, jumped back into the sea and escaped, despite heavy bleeding, thanks to several canoes that had launched from shore to rescue him. It was astonishing that this brutal pursuit and mistreatment of the poor fellow did not cost them the trust or affection of the islanders. Everything remained as calm and peaceful as before. The captains even brought Attaha and another local commander aboard for dinner, and trade continued as smoothly as if nothing had happened. The commander who came with Attaha appeared to be of higher rank, as Attaha, who normally sat at the table with them, now took a few steps back and sat on the floor, refusing to eat in the other's presence. This man was an older fellow with watery eyes, to whom the other people in the canoes showed such great respect that the sailors assumed he must hold at least the rank of admiral. However, nothing in his clothing indicated that he was of higher rank, since the islanders apparently knew nothing of extravagance or ostentatious dress. Yet this did not mean they lacked respect for the nobler members of their society. On the Society Islands, the opposite was true. The reverence Attaha showed the other commander was considerable, but it was nothing compared to what they experienced on land. There they encountered a middle-aged man sitting on the ground near the trading area, surrounded by a circle of islanders. Some of the sailors who had been out hunting reported that they had seen this man in Maria Bay. All the islanders passing by had thrown themselves to the ground before him, kissed his feet, and placed them on their heads. Upon further inquiry, they learned from several sources that he was the head of the entire island, just as Captain Cook was the commander of their ships. His name was Ko Hagi Tu Falango. Whether this was his name or his title, they couldn't determine, since they never again heard these words from any of the islanders. However many they asked, all consistently confirmed that he was their Arigi, or king. They added that he was also called Latu Nipuru. It was assumed that Latu was the title, since that same word appeared in the language spoken on the Cocos, Verrader, and Horn Islands, located only a few degrees farther north, and visited by Schouten and Lemaire in 1616. They felt justified in this assumption because, according to the vocabulary lists of those explorers, the language in those regions matched the local one in many ways, and because the behavior and customs of those inhabitants, as described, closely resembled those found here. Georg and the others were eager to get to know this Latu better, so they approached him, and the captains presented him with gifts, which he accepted so woodenly and indifferently that one might have thought him completely insensitive and simple-minded. Among the gifts was a shirt, which they helped him put on so he would know how to wear it. Yet his clumsy manner made it quite difficult. He probably wouldn't even have thanked them if an old woman sitting behind him hadn't kept reminding him to do so. In the end, he simply raised each item over his head and muttered nothing more than "Fagafetai." The priest who had led the two captains to the burial ground on the first day of their arrival was also in the same circle of islanders where the Latu sat. He boldly drank the intoxicating pepperwater. It was served in small square cups, artfully folded and braided from banana leaves, and he insisted that Georg and the others should try it as well. It was offered to them very politely, and out of politeness they tasted it too. The drink was milky white, but had a nauseatingly bland taste and left an unpleasant burning on the tongue. The priest consumed such large quantities of this vile liquid every evening that he was constantly drunk. No wonder his memory failed during prayer. His body was thin, his skin scaly, his face wrinkled, and his eyes red and weeping. He was held in high esteem by the people, and a crowd of attendants eagerly assisted him with full cups. The gifts they gave him he kept for himself, while Attaha and others passed everything they received on to their superiors. He had a daughter who received many presents from the Europeans, as she was remarkably well-formed and lighter-skinned than the other women there, who all seemed to treat her with a certain respect. Fair skin and softer facial features were natural consequences of a comfortable, idle lifestyle, one that spared a person from the heat of the sun and provided an abundance of the land's finest and most delicious offerings. This appeared to be the case here, and suggested that religion, as with so many other peoples, served as a veil for luxury and indulgence. Though things had not yet gone that far, even a spark of this tendency could be enough to spread widely and unstoppably in the future. The obedience and devotion of the people toward their superiors showed that the local system of government was not entirely despotic, but also far from democratic. In this way, luxury could soon find its place here. What Georg had said about these two islands also applied to the islands lying farther west. The reliable reports of Schouten, Lemaire, and Tasman about these islands matched the observations they had made themselves. The inhabitants of these islands were consistently engaged in trade and had always received foreigners who landed among them with friendliness and hospitality. For this reason, they referred to these islands, originally discovered by Schouten and Tasman, as the Friendly Islands. Although Georg knew that Schouten's boats had been attacked with hostility by the natives of the Cocos, Traitor, Hope, and Horn Islands, it did not diminish the name.
That wraps up episode 32 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution with Captain Cook. You'll find a map of the locations we visited in the show notes. To see how these places appear today, head over to my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I follow Forster's route and explore its legacy in the modern world. Be sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter of this remarkable voyage, because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.